northern Iwo Jima. The volcanic island was a place where death and fire had claimed nearly every corner, leaving a landscape of black ash, jagged rock, and shattered human ambition. Smoke still drifted from recent bombardments, mingling with the sulfurous fumes that clung to the jagged cliffs and shallow caves. For Private Kenta Hiroshi, a young Japanese soldier of the 145th Infantry Regiment, the war had become both an ordeal of endurance and a trial of conscience. Hiroshi had been part of a small unit stationed in the northern highlands, a maze of tunnels and fortifications overseen by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. His orders had been clear: hold the line, delay the Americans, and inflict maximum casualties. But the reality on the ground was chaotic. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Most of his comrades had fallen over the preceding days, some in sudden artillery strikes, others in banzai charges that ended in futile slaughter. By the morning of February 10th, the unit that had once numbered over 50 men was reduced to a handful, scattered and disoriented. Kenta crouched in a narrow crevice in the volcanic rock, his uniform torn, his body coated in layers of ash and sweat. Around him lay the remnants of a battlefield that had become a graveyard, shattered helmets, splintered rifles, and the twisted forms of men who had simply vanished under the inferno of firepower. His own rifle, an aged Arisaka Type 99, felt heavy in his hands. Its wooden stock was scarred from repeated use, its iron sights dulled by sand and ash. He cleaned it again, not because he believed it would save him, but because ritual gave him a semblance of control in a world that had stripped him of all agency. The mornings were the worst. After a night of near silence, broken only by distant artillery, the sun would rise over Mount Suribachi, and the Americans would return, advancing slowly, yet relentlessly, their boots steering the volcanic ash as they crept toward Japanese lines. The island seemed alive with their presence. Kenta could hear the faint whirring of flamethrower tanks, the crackle of machine gun fire, the staccato of mortars landing in craters that had only hours before been solid ground. His body ached with exhaustion, but he forced himself to remain motionless. The day the rest of his squad fell, it had begun like any other, a distant roar, then the violent impact of shells tearing the cliffs apart. He remembered the scream of Private Hayashi as a shell struck the rock above them, throwing fragments into the air. He remembered the coughing, the choking dust, and the sudden silence after the detonation, a silence that carried the weight of death. When he finally emerged from his makeshift cover, the others were gone, their bodies buried under rubble or scattered across the black ash. Alone, Kenta realized, meant something deeper than solitude. It meant becoming a ghost in the midst of living death. Hiroshi moved cautiously, navigating a network of shallow caves and tunnels that Kuribayashi's engineers had carved into the volcanic rock. These passages, intended for coordinated defensive positions, had become both refuge and prison. In daylight, he could see the devastation wrought by naval bombardments, entire cliff faces reduced to rubble, pillboxes crushed under the weight of direct hits, and sandbags ripped apart by mortar fire. Yet beneath the surface, the tunnels remained intact. Here, in the shadows, Kenta found a strange, uneasy sanctuary. He rationed his supplies carefully. Food had become a distant memory. What little rice or dried fish remained from his last resupply had been eaten within days. Water was even scarcer. He discovered small pools of rainwater in rock depressions, and when none was available, he relied on condensation from his damp surroundings, a method that barely sustained him. Illness was constant. Dysentery, heat rash, and exhaustion gnawed at his body. His uniform reeked of sweat and ash, and he had long since abandoned any attempt at hygiene. Survival required suppression of discomfort, denial of weakness, and a steadfast will to live another day. Yet it was not only physical endurance that challenged him. Kenta's mind became a battleground. Memories of home, of his family in Hiroshima, emerged unbidden. He thought of his younger sister, Miyako, who had once begged him not to go to war. He remembered his mother's tearful embrace before he left for training, the weight of duty pressing down upon him. These recollections, though painful, were sustenance in themselves. They reminded him of a life beyond the volcanic ash and the relentless killing that defined Iwo Jima. By the 5th day alone, Hiroshi had learned to move silently across the terrain, using the island's natural cover to avoid detection. He discovered that the Americans, despite their overwhelming firepower, were often cautious, probing slowly, avoiding unnecessary exposure to potential ambushes. He began to understand the rhythm of their patrols, when they moved along the ridges, when their flamethrower tanks advanced, when small groups scouted the cliff edges. Using this knowledge, he scavenged supplies left behind, food scraps from abandoned positions, even occasionally taking ammunition from fallen soldiers to maintain his rifle. It was during the 8th day that the first gesture of unexpected humanity appeared. Kenta had taken cover in a shallow cave near the eastern ridge. From his position, he could see an American patrol moving carefully through the ash, rifles at the ready. He froze, expecting immediate engagement. But instead of firing, the patrol stopped, one soldier kneeling to place a small package against a rock before retreating. Kenta blinked. Food? Here? Surely this was a trap. Hiroshi waited hours, watching the patrol disappear over the horizon before daring to move. Cautiously, he approached the package. Inside were tins of warm rice, a small piece of salted fish, and even a crude note written in English. Eat. Survive. You are not our enemy. He could not read every word, but the intent was clear. Confusion and suspicion warred with hunger and relief. Yet here, in the middle of a battlefield that had already claimed most of his comrades, these strangers offered sustenance without question. Over the following days, this strange routine became a lifeline. Every morning, as the Americans moved through their patrols, Kenta would find food left at the edge of his hiding place. A tin of stew, sometimes even tea heated over a small fire that had been left behind. He never saw the soldiers who brought the food. They remained distant, shadows in the landscape, careful to avoid direct contact. But the gesture, repeated day after day, began to affect him in ways he could not articulate. The war, which had seemed like a monolithic force intent on destroying him, revealed cracks of humanity in its armor. Each day, Kenta faced the constant threat of detection, the ever-present danger of bombardment, and the creeping toll of isolation. He marked time by the position of the sun over Mount Suribachi, by the changing pattern of American movements, and by the condition of his own body. He had developed a routine. Emerge from cover at dawn to scavenge, retreat during midday bombardment, move silently at dusk to inspect patrol patterns, and sleep fitfully in his shallow cave at night. The volcanic ash made every step noisy. Every wrong movement could betray his presence. Hiroshi began to understand the landscape not as a place of death, but as a canvas of survival. Each crater, each boulder, each scarred cliff offered opportunities. He could slip through narrow passages, hide beneath rock overhangs, and even use the smoke of distant fires to mask his movements. His body became attuned to the vibrations in the earth, the subtle sounds of enemy patrols, and the distant rumble of naval guns. Survival, he realized, required a harmony with the terrain, a patience cultivated through relentless observation and adaptation. Despite the constant danger, Kenta retained a sense of purpose. Each meal left by the Americans reinforced the fragile notion that not all humanity had been extinguished in the fire of war. He began to leave small tokens in return, scraps of cloth fashioned into crude talismans placed near the packages, a silent acknowledgement of gratitude that the patrols would never witness. This ritual became a bridge across an unspoken understanding that even in the depths of violence and chaos, empathy could survive. The psychological strain, however, was immense. Nights were haunted by the screams of dying men, the echoing detonations of shells, and the unrelenting wind carrying the sulfurous smell of the island. Kenta sometimes conversed aloud with himself, rehearsing strategies, recounting memories of home, or reciting letters he had written in his mind to his family. Writing was impossible, paper was long gone, but the act of speaking, even to empty air, became a method of maintaining sanity. He imagined his family alive, smiling, and believing he might one day return, even if logic insisted otherwise. By the end of the second week, Kenta's body had adapted to the scarcity. Hunger no longer gnawed with the same intensity. Thirst had become an endurance test he had learned to endure with controlled breathing and rationed sips. He had become adept at scavenging, heating water over rocks, catching small lizards or insects for protein, collecting condensation in leaves to supplement his meager water supply. Each day was an exercise in resourcefulness, and each success reinforced his will to live. As the third week began, Hiroshi's awareness of time blurred. Days and nights merged into a continuum of vigilance and survival. The American patrols continued their rounds, their faces invisible, their intent unclear. He knew that capture could mean death, yet each morning the tin of hot rice and fish awaited him, a daily paradox of threat and compassion. He had become part of an unspoken ritual, a lone soldier sustained by the enemy he had been trained to despise. It was during these weeks that Kenta reflected deeply on the nature of war, duty, and human connection. Kuribayashi's strategy of maximum attrition was evident in every encounter on the island. The Americans were relentless, but so too was the determination to endure, to survive, to resist. Futility of endless killing. He could see the fragility of life in its purest form. The men on both sides were bound by circumstance, thrust into a crucible that demanded sacrifice, but offered no true victory. By the end of Chapter Uno, Kenta Hiroshi had transformed. From a young soldier consumed by fear and uncertainty, he had become a figure of quiet resilience, sustained by ingenuity, observation, and the strange mercy of an enemy whose intentions were simple yet profound: to feed him, to preserve his life. Alone on a volcanic island, scarred by fire and death, he discovered a paradox at the heart of conflict, that even amid the hell of battle, human kindness could persist, forging bonds that transcended ideology, uniforms, and nationality. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima bore witness to his solitary struggle, each grain a silent observer of courage, suffering, and the will to endure. And as the sun dipped behind Mount Suribachi, casting long shadows over the cratered landscape, Kenta knew the days ahead would demand even more than he had yet endured. Yet, for the first time since the bombardment began, he felt a fragile glimmer of hope that he could survive, hope that life might persist beyond the relentless cruelty of war, and hope that even in the darkest of battles, humanity could shine through. February 27, 1945, Northern Iwo Jima. A week had passed since Kenta Hiroshi had become accustomed to the strange rhythm of survival. The sudden appearances of American patrols leaving food at the edges of his hiding places. The volcanic ash, ever present and ever persistent, coated his skin, his hair, and the inside of his lungs. Each step across the black sand was like moving through time itself, slow, deliberate, and heavy with consequence. Kenta had learned to observe everything. Every sound, every shadow, every movement of enemy soldiers could mean life or death. Over the past week, he had grown attuned to the patrol's patterns. They moved slowly, deliberately, scanning for threats but avoiding unnecessary risk. Their discipline was meticulous, a sharp contrast to the chaotic fury of Japanese Bansai charges he had witnessed in the opening days of the battle. He knew that they had the firepower to annihilate him instantly, yet they approached with a strange caution that piqued his curiosity and heightened his suspicion. On the morning of February 27, a patrol approached his usual supply drop point. Kenta lay flat against a jagged rock formation, his rifle beside him, heart hammering in his chest. From his vantage, he saw 3 soldiers, faces masked by scarves against the volcanic dust, moving carefully, scanning the terrain. One of them placed a tin package against a boulder and stepped back, motioning to the others before retreating toward the ridge. They did not fire, They did not call his name. They merely left the sustenance and disappeared into the ash as silently as they had come. Hiroshi waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, burning the ash beneath him and intensifying the smell of sulfur and scorched earth. Only when the patrol was gone did he approach. The package contained rice, dried fish, and a small portion of meat preserved in salt. Alongside it was a crude note written in English: "Eat, survive, we watch. We will not harm you if you do not fight us." He did not understand every word, but he grasped the intent. Hesitation warred with hunger. His training screamed that this could be a trap, yet his body demanded nourishment. Carefully, he took the tins, moving back into the shadows. Sitting cross-legged against the cool volcanic rock, he heated the contents over a small fire and ate. The warmth of the food, the taste of rice softened by heat, was almost unimaginable after days of scavenged scraps. Each bite reinforced a paradox: that enemies could offer life amid destruction, and that survival might depend not solely on stealth, but on trust, an alien concept in the midst of total war. The days that followed established a pattern. Kenta would remain hidden, emerging only when the patrols moved near. The Americans never approached him directly. They left food daily, always at dawn, always carefully placed at predetermined spots. Over time, he noticed subtle signals. Small rocks stacked in a certain pattern, scratches in the ash indicating that the patrol had passed, even slight depressions in the sand showing the wind's interference. He began to anticipate their arrivals, moving to collect the packages before animals or debris could interfere. Isolation, however, weighed heavily. The volcanic landscape offered no company beyond the distant roar of naval guns and the occasional echo of artillery. The silence of the tunnels where he sometimes rested was oppressive, broken only by his own breathing and the faint trickle of condensation from the rock. Nights were the worst, with memories surfacing unbidden, the faces of fallen, comrades, the cries of the wounded, the screams that haunted the tunnels. He spoke aloud to himself, reciting letters he imagined to his family, narrating the movements of the patrols, even whispering prayers to gods whose names he could no longer recall. Each word was a tether to sanity, a bridge to a life that existed beyond the ash. By the second week, Kenta began to explore further. Hunger and necessity forced him to expand his range, navigating the jagged northern cliffs where rubble and cratered terrain made movement perilous. His rifle remained at the ready, fingers lightly tracing the trigger. Yet, he discovered opportunities amid the destruction. Abandoned foxholes contained tins of American rations, broken crates revealed ammunition and small tools useful for survival. Each find extended his life by hours, days, or even weeks. One day, while scavenging near a partially destroyed pillbox, Kenta discovered a wounded American soldier trapped beneath rubble. He froze instinct, screaming at him to flee. Yet something curiosity, compassion, or a fleeting sense of shared humanity compelled him to observe. The soldier was unconscious, breathing shallowly, his uniform torn and caked with ash. Kenta had no medical training beyond basic field first aid, and he knew that helping might draw attention, yet he could not simply leave him to die. Kenta worked quickly, shifting debris and propping the injured man with rocks to prevent further collapse. He found a tin of water among his scavenged supplies and managed to moisten the soldier's lips. He did not speak, knowing that any sound might be fatal. Hours passed, and the soldier stirred, groaning faintly. Hiroshi retreated to the shadows, watching. He expected a shout, a reaction, perhaps even aggression. But the soldier merely opened his eyes, weak and disoriented, then returned to unconsciousness. That evening, when the patrol passed near the same area, they left additional rations. Kenta observed them, carefully. They did not approach the injured man. The incident marked a turning point. Kenta realized that the Americans were aware of his presence they had always known but chose not to engage. The daily food deliveries were not merely sustenance, they were a signal, an acknowledgement of life amid war. The patrols had created an unspoken boundary. They would feed, but not fight. provided Kenta did not attempt attacks or leave his designated territory. Survival now depended on respect for that silent contract. Psychologically, the days became a test of patience and fortitude. Kenta's body adapted to the extreme conditions, temperatures reaching 50 degrees Celsius in sun-exposed areas, nights plunging to near freezing within tunnels, scarce water supplies forcing rationing. Dysentery and heat rash persisted, yet he learned to cope. He created small systems for hygiene, scraping ash from his skin, using condensation to wash, and rationing food to maintain strength. Each act of preparation, each cautious movement, reinforced his sense of agency in a world that seemed otherwise governed by chaos. American forces pressed deeper into northern Iwo Jima, reducing the Japanese defensive perimeter and isolating the remaining pockets of resistance. Kenta remained unseen, a shadow in the volcanic landscape. From his vantage points, he observed flamethrower tanks and marine infantry advancing, often suffering heavy casualties as they encountered hidden bunkers and tunnel networks. Despite his training and allegiance, he could not suppress a sense of admiration for their discipline and determination. Hunger remained a constant threat. By the third week alone, Kenta had consumed nearly every tin left by patrols, supplementing with small foraged meals, lizards, insects, and roots that offered minimal nutrition. He had learned to store water in leaves, using the early morning condensation to maintain hydration. This was tenuous. The scarcity demanded constant vigilance. His body, once flexible and strong, had become lean and wiry, muscles hardened by necessity and constant movement, but joints ached from overuse and exposure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Despite the harsh conditions, Kenta developed a routine that became ritualized. Each morning, he inspected the ash fields for patrol signs, collecting the daily food packages and noting any changes in enemy movement. Midday was spent in hidden crevices or tunnels, resting and conserving energy. Afternoon and evening were dedicated to reconnaissance, observing supply caches, noting areas of risk, and preparing for possible encounters. Night brought sleep in shallow caves, often interrupted by distant artillery or the muffled sounds of fighting. Alive in his vicinity, a torn helmet, a discarded rifle, or the remnants of a foxhole became grim reminders of mortality. Yet each discovery also reinforced his will to survive, to endure where others had fallen. He began to imagine himself as a sentinel, a lone witness to the ongoing carnage. Each day survived was a quiet triumph, a testament to adaptability and perseverance. On March 10th, the patrol left an unusually large package, multiple tins of rice, preserved meat, and even a small tin of tea. Kenta hesitated, sensing a change. He moved cautiously, inspecting the surrounding area. Hours passed, and no soldiers approached. The package was genuine. For the first time, he realized that the patrol had come to understand him not just as a soldier, but as a living presence in their operational theatre. They had established a fragile relationship, one predicated on mutual respect, fear, and the recognition of shared humanity amid a landscape of relentless destruction. By mid-March, Kenta's perspective began to shift. The Americans were no longer faceless enemies. They had become part of his environment, patterns in the ash that he could anticipate and study. He began leaving subtle markers, tiny scratches in the sand, or small piles of ash that he hoped might communicate a silent acknowledgement of the food left for him. Though he could not speak their language, he sensed that his survival depended on maintaining this unspoken dialogue. Kenta's nights became contemplative. He thought of home, Hiroshima, the streets lined with cherry trees, the laughter of his sister Miyako, the quiet wisdom of his mother. Memories were both solace and torment. He imagined the letters he might have written had the war been different, had he survived. Each night he whispered these letters into the dark, as if the act itself could preserve his humanity against the consuming violence surrounding him. The physical toll was relentless. His skin, darkened by ash and sun, bore. burns and sores from constant exposure. His hands were calloused from climbing jagged rocks, handling rifles, and manipulating scarce supplies. His feet, hardened by volcanic sand, bled occasionally but healed quickly in the dry heat. Sleep was fractured, often interrupted by distant artillery or the sudden approach of American patrols. Each night required vigilance. Any lapse could mean instant death. By March Kinseth, Kenta had been alone for nearly a month. His body was a testament to survival, lean, agile, and wary. His mind, sharpened by isolation and observation, had become attuned to patterns, rhythms, and subtle changes in the environment. The unspoken relationship with the patrol continued. Each day they left food, each day he took care to remain hidden. He also began to reflect on the meaning of war itself. Kuribayashi's strategy, the planned attrition, and the futility of Bansai charges now seemed distant concepts rendered immediate through lived experience. He saw that survival, not glory, had become the ultimate objective. He had witnessed courage on both sides, the disciplined advance of Marines, the sacrifices of his fallen comrades, and the quiet resolve of soldiers who, like him, clung to life amid devastation. In the volcanic ash and shattered tunnels of northern Iwo Jima, Kenta Hiroshi endured. He ate, rested, observed, and adapted. The patrols continued to leave food, a daily ritual that had transformed into a lifeline. Each day was both a continuation of battle and a negotiation with mortality. Each night brought reflection and whispered letters to imagined family, preserving the thread of humanity that war had sought to sever. By the close of Chapter Dose, Kenta was no longer merely a survivor. He had become a living witness, a solitary figure navigating the intersection of life, death, and mercy. The patrols, the ash, the tunnels, and the distant roar of naval guns had become his world. He understood that the next 2 weeks would test him further. American forces would continue their advance, resources would dwindle, and survival would demand every ounce of skill, cunning, and willpower. Yet he had endured 30 days alone, sustained by food left by enemies who had chosen compassion over cruelty. And, amid the ash, the tunnels, and the silence, he discovered something profound. That even in the hell of Iwo Jima, amid the relentless machinery of war, the simple act of feeding a human being could create a fragile bridge between enemies, a connection that might, in some small way, preserve the humanity of all involved. March 17, 1945. Northern Iwo Jima. Kenta Hiroshi had survived 30 days in isolation, 30 days of ash, heat, and silence, punctuated only by the strange ritual of American patrols leaving food at the edge of his hiding places. The volcanic landscape had become both enemy and companion, shaping his body, mind, and spirit in ways he could never have imagined. By now, the battle had reached its most intense phase. American forces had pushed deeper into northern Iwo Jima, reducing the Japanese perimeter to scattered pockets of resistance, many already destroyed or abandoned. Explosions rocketed the cliffs and ridges daily, shaking loose rocks and sending plumes of black ash into the sky. The sound of flamethrower tanks, artillery barrages, and distant gunfire was constant, a mechanical heartbeat that reminded Kenta that he was living inside a war machine too vast to comprehend. Yet, amidst the chaos, he endured. Kenta moved cautiously across the black sand, scanning the horizon. He had memorized the patrol routes. Their presence was predictable, a rhythm in the madness. The Americans never tried to capture him, they merely left sustenance and retreated. He had grown accustomed to their methodical discipline, even beginning to recognize individual soldiers by their movement patterns, way they carried packs. Though he could not communicate with them, a strange bond had formed, an unspoken contract of mutual respect and survival. This morning the patrol left something unusual, a small bundle wrapped in cloth tucked under a protruding boulder. Kenta approached carefully, rifle in hand, and unwrapped it. Inside were cooked rice, dried meat, a small bottle of water, and most surprisingly a tiny notebook with a pencil. He paused, staring at the simple gift. Writing had become a ritual in his solitude, a way to preserve his thoughts and maintain sanity. He carefully accepted the notebook, recognizing that it offered not just nourishment, but a conduit to humanity, a lifeline in the volcanic wasteland. Kenta settled against a jagged outcrop and began to write. He recorded the sequence of the patrols, the layout of the terrain, and his observations of the American advance, but his entries quickly shifted from tactical notes to reflections. He wrote of his memories, his family in Hiroshima, his sister Miyako's laughter, the quiet wisdom of his mother, and the stern yet loving guidance of his father. Each memory was a lifeline, tethering him to a world outside the ash and tunnels. Writing became a ritual, a declaration that he still existed, that he had survived, and that he had a story beyond the endless struggle for survival. The volcanic landscape, ever harsh, continued to test him. Temperatures soared, often exceeding 50 degrees Celsius in exposed areas, and at night the tunnels became near freezing. Water was scarce, rationed meticulously to prevent dehydration. Dysentery, heat rash, and minor infections were constant companions. His body had adapted in strange ways, lean and wiry, muscles hardened from constant movement and vigilance. Yet joints ached, feet blistered from the volcanic sand, and hands caroused from climbing rocks and handling weapons. Sleep was never deep, always fractured by distant artillery, or the subtle sounds of approaching patrols. Yet, Kenta had established several hiding spots, each stocked with scavenged supplies and marked with subtle signs only he could interpret. He moved between them like a shadow, appearing only when necessary to collect food or observe enemy movements. The Americans continued their ritual, leaving sustenance at predictable intervals, never speaking, never approaching directly. It was a delicate balance, a dance of life and death in which any misstep could mean annihilation. The intensity of the battle escalated. The northern cliffs, where Kenta primarily operated, became the site of relentless American assaults. Flamethrower tanks and marine infantry advanced, often suffering heavy casualties against remaining Japanese fortifications. Kenta observed from hidden vantage points, noting the destruction of bunkers, the collapse of tunnel entrances, and the meticulous work of engineers sealing remaining defensive positions. Despite his allegiance, he could not suppress a sense of awe at the American discipline and determination. Inside, he found a wounded Japanese soldier, barely conscious, clutching a bloodied rifle. Recognition of his fellow countrymen's suffering sparked a complex mix of duty, fear, and empathy. He approached cautiously, offering water and small portions of food he had scavenged. The soldier's eyes fluttered open, and he whispered fragmented words of thanks before slipping back into unconsciousness. Kenta realized that he could not save everyone, yet he could preserve life where possible, a principle that had guided him throughout his isolation. By March 2000, food scarcity became critical. The daily patrol deliveries had slowed, likely due to intensified fighting or changes in American strategy. Meal was calculated. Each sip of water measured with precision. Hunger sharpened his senses, heightened his vigilance, and reinforced the importance of every decision. Mistakes could no longer be afforded. The margin for error had vanished. The psychological strain was immense. Isolation forced Kenta into constant introspection. He recited letters to his family, wrote in his notebook, and conversed with himself to preserve sanity. Memories of fallen comrades and the cries of the wounded haunted him. At times, he questioned the meaning of survival, why he had endured while so many had perished. March 24 marked a pivotal moment. Kenta noticed that the American patrols had altered their approach, leaving food further inland and closer to the advancing front lines. This suggested that they recognized his growing mobility and adaptation. He moved cautiously to retrieve the supplies, noting the subtle signs they left. Stacked stones, scratches in the ash, and faint indentations indicating safe passage. He realized that the Americans had come to respect his presence, acknowledging him as a living entity in a battlefield dominated by death. By March 25, the Japanese defensive positions in northern Iwo Jima were nearly obliterated. Kenta observed from a ridge as Marines advanced through what remained of the tunnel networks, using flamethrowers, explosives, and coordinated infantry maneuvers to eliminate resistance. The landscape was unrecognizable, a combination of black ash, cratered terrain, and shattered fortifications. Yet, amidst this destruction, Kenta remained unseen. He had become a ghost, moving through the remnants of a once formidable defensive network, sustained only by the ritualistic care of enemy soldiers. The nights were the most challenging. Exhaustion, hunger, and the constant threat of discovery created a relentless tension, Kenta wrote. In his notebook, documenting his observations, his thoughts, and his reflections on humanity, he pondered the paradox of survival. Enemies had become caretakers, bridges of trust had formed amid chaos, and life had persisted in a place dominated by death. Each night, he whispered letters to his family, imagining that his words might somehow reach them across the void of war. On March 26th, the final assault on northern Iwo Jima commenced. Kenta observed from a hidden vantage point as American forces moved systematically, sealing tunnels, clearing bunkers, and consolidating control. The volume of firepower was overwhelming, yet he remained unseen, relying on instinct, observation, and the protective cover of volcanic terrain. The patrols continued to leave small supplies, though the frequency had decreased, likely due to operational constraints. Kenta's physical state was precarious. Weeks of isolation, limited nutrition, and constant movement had taken their toll. And hardened, but fatigue was undeniable. Minor injuries had become chronic, and sleep remained fragmented. Yet his mind was sharp, honed by necessity and constant vigilance. He understood the terrain, the movements of the enemy, and the subtle cues of survival better than any soldier on the island. That evening, Kenta approached a supply drop left near a partially collapsed ridge. Inside, he found not only food but a small message, scrawled in English. "Survive. The fighting is almost over. You are free to move. Do not fight unless necessary." The words struck him with a mixture of relief and disbelief. After 30 days of solitude, the ritual of fear, observation, and cautious negotiation with mortality, the invisible contract had shifted. Survival was no longer solely a matter of hiding and scavenging. It was now an acknowledgement that the world was changing, that the battle was concluding, and that he might endure beyond the ash and tunnels. In the following days, Kenta moved, cautiously toward areas increasingly controlled by American forces. He remained vigilant, observing the movements of troops, the positions of tanks, and the ongoing consolidation of the island. Yet there was a new awareness. The war around him was ending. The relentless shelling, the explosions, and the cries of combat were diminishing. He had survived 30 days alone, guided by the strange and fragile mercy of a patrol that had balanced compassion and caution. By March 20th, Kenta emerged from his final hiding place. The northern cliffs were largely under American control, the tunnel networks neutralized, and the landscape scarred beyond recognition. He stepped onto the black volcanic sand, rifle in hand, but with a new sense of possibility. He approached a patrol cautiously, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender and recognition. The soldiers, familiar with the ghostly figure they had watched for a month, did not fire. They guided him toward the center of their lines, offering water, medical attention, and reassurance. Kenta's body and spirit were battered, yet he had endured. The patrol had provided sustenance, observation, and a silent acknowledgement of his presence, creating a fragile lifeline in a place dominated by death. His survival was not only a testament to adaptability and skill, but also a reflection of the humanity that could persist even amid the most brutal conflicts. In the aftermath, Kenta was treated by American medics. He received food, clean water, and medical care for minor injuries and exhaustion, yet the psychological scars of 30 days alone remained. He wrote in his notebook, documenting every detail, the patrols, the ash, the tunnels, and the rituals that had sustained him. He reflected on the paradox of war. Enemies could be caretakers, Survival depended on observation and patience, and even in the hell of Iwo Jima, acts of mercy could preserve life and humanity. Kenta's story became known among the American forces, a ghostly testament to survival amid devastation. The patrols who had sustained him were praised for their unusual discretion and humanity, recognized for their role in preserving a life in a battlefield defined by death. Kenta himself, though forever marked by the experience, carried the knowledge that survival had been a negotiation between fear, skill, and fragile trust. The volcanic island, scarred and blackened, stood as a testament to the horrors and complexities of war. Kenta Hiroshi, once a solitary figure navigating the ash and tunnels, had survived 30 days of isolation, guided by the unseen hands of those who balanced duty with compassion. His story, recorded in notebooks and whispered memories, became a symbol of endurance, adaptability, and the possibility of humanity even amidst the most unforgiving circumstances. In the weeks that followed, Kenta began the slow process of reintegration. He worked alongside medics, shared his observations with officers, and helped map the remaining tunnel networks. Yet the solitude, the ash, and the memory of 30 days, spent alone, lingered. Every shadow, every volcanic ridge, and every whisper of wind reminded him of the delicate balance between life and death, the paradox of survival, and the unexpected bridges forged even between enemies. By the time he left Iwo Jima, Kenta Hiroshi had endured more than most soldiers ever would. His story became a quiet legend. A Japanese soldier who survived 30 days alone, fed and observed by the very enemies who had consumed the island in fire and steel. His survival was a testament to patience, skill, adaptability, and the fragile humanity that could persist even in the most brutal conflicts. And in the ash and tunnels of Iwo Jima, the memory of those 30 days endured, a ghostly reminder that even amid devastation, life could persist, and that compassion, however small, however silent, could save a human being even in the heart of war. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.